this enormous investment in technology that we've seen in China over many years actually fundamentally means that UK forces in any war in the next decade are going to be facing Chinese technology.
A lot of smaller or medium-sized enterprises want to work on defense-related missions but don't actually recognize what that means for them in terms of their own cybersecurity burden and so on, because they make themselves a target for Russia and China essentially without realizing.
There's clearly potential for greater defence spending to contribute to growth, but I think if we make it the primary goal, either signalling to President Trump or hitting an arbitrary percent GDP target for spending, we muddy the waters of what we're trying to do, which is be more secure.
Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. In the world of today, the front line is here. Those were the words of the Prime Minister as he launched the Strategic Defence Review this week at a shipyard in Glasgow. The 140-page review assesses the threats Britain faces. It outlines what capabilities it needs to counter them, as well as the state of the UK armed forces now. Today we're going to be looking at how credible this plan is, or whether it's just a wish list without the money to back it up. We'll also examine what this review tells us about the government's strategy and how it sees Britain's place on the world stage. And finally, we'll look at the balance the review strikes between hard power and the new hybrid warfare. Well, I'm joined by a fleet, or squadron, of Chatham House experts. They are Grace Cassy, Marion, Messmer and Olivia O'Sullivan. Welcome to you all. It's a very big document, and I'm keen to get into the detail. But first, Grace, you were appointed by the Defence Secretary as one of the external experts working on this review. What did your work consist of?
Well, it was an unusual process for a defence review because it was externally led for the first time. We had a team of the 3 lead reviewers, 6 additional external experts. We had a secretariat, as would be normal in a review of this kind. But we also conducted a very thorough and extensive external consultation, seeking input from individual citizens, from veterans, from think tanks and academics, from industry, from our allies. And we received thousands of submissions, which were all read both by humans and AI to give us a fantastic set of insight for us to draw upon. We then conducted a series of review and challenge panels through the period at the end of last year, where we got into great detail across 20 or so themes with defence leaders themselves. So we were able to hear the voices and the priorities of all the leadership in defence across the 3 services, Stratcom, the nuclear organisation and medical intelligence and so forth.
It was led by George Robertson, the former NATO chief, who has a long association with Chatham House. How long was the process?
The process itself, we began in August of 2024. And most of our consultations were completed by the end of December. And then our writing and, if you like, debating phase took place through the first quarter of this year.
And I must ask you, though, we'll get into the detail of this, but Donald Trump arrived in the Oval Office as you were completing that in January. Did that extend the process?
I don't know that it extended the process. I think it certainly gave us some additional clarity on our thinking. It was clear when the new administration came in that their relative weight they placed on Europe was declining. And the message very clearly delivered publicly is that it was now time for Europe to stand up and take more responsibility for its own defence. That's, of course, I think not the first time that message has been received. So I don't think it was
remember it echoing down the decades.
Indeed. So, but I think it has helped to crystallise some thinking and to make clear that a greater pace would be necessary.
Thank you for that. Well, let's, with that, plunge into some of the detail. And Olivia, I'd love to start with you and what struck you most about this.
I think this is an interesting example of a defence review because, in a way, there was less focus on describing the UK's strategic place in the world and the way the UK state sees that, and a bit more internal reflection on the state of UK defence and what needs to change. As Grace says, there's a very clear focus and priority there on European security, on what they call NATO first, not NATO only, but NATO first. But a lot of the detail is about how can we rebuild what the government and the external reviewers have diagnosed as a hollowed out force. There's an awful lot in there about technology. Technology is threaded through the review, but I think a welcome focus on thinking about technology by drawing on lessons from Ukraine, an ally that is adapting, building an innovative, tech-enabled defence sector during a war, and thinking about technology and in terms of how it can help defence organise itself better rather than having lots of exquisitely procured tech. So it's a kind of quite realistic approach to tech rather than an approach to tech that sounds like it comes from the claims and pitches of tech companies or the tech industry. Above all, I think you can hear these echoes of lessons from Ukraine, not just the way in which Ukraine has reordered European security, forced a focus on Russia as the primary threat, but the practical lessons that the way Ukraine has fought its war have forced the UK to rethink the way it thinks about defence. I find that really striking.
So some real new thinking there in your view. What do you make of the money charge? The whole chorus of responses to this, but I'm thinking, for example, of Max Hastings in the Times saying, without more money, this is just a wish list.
I don't think it's just a wish list. It's a long list with perhaps not enough money for all of the big ticket items in there. Let's not diminish that this government is increasing defence spending. It's going from 2.3% of GDP to 2.5% by 2027. It's aiming for 3% by the next parliament. By some forecasts, that will mean by the 2030s we'll be spending about £17 billion more. And this is a government that came in with many other calls on the public purse, hoping to rebuild public services with massive challenges. These are difficult choices, and they have made some. They haven't put a firm deadline on that 3% figure, and they may, in a matter of days, get pressure from NATO to set an even higher spending target. The external experts who led the review say they're confident that everything in there is affordable. I think if you look at some independent analysis, that's a bold claim, given it doesn't make trade-offs. There are no real cuts in here. The AUKUS project to develop nuclear attack submarines with Australia and the US remains. In fact, the review suggests will ramp up production. The new fighter jet project with Italy and Japan, the nuclear deterrent and its modernisation, rebuilding the army, making sure we can provide what we've promised to NATO. All of these things together in an envelope of 3% is tight.
And thanks for turning it into real money, because we're conscious in the background of the fight going on in Whitehall at the moment about the spending review due to complete next week. So 17 billion more on top of what is 54 billion at the moment and rising. That is not a small sum. Marion, what do you make of this last point that Olivia mentioned? The charge against the UK for a long time has been of trying to do lots of things, some of them very big, some of them small, and stretching out its money over this big range of things. Did you see any departure from that?
So I think the increase of defence spending is the biggest departure from that, right? Because what we've seen with past reviews is that there were still pretty ambitious goals, such as increasing UK presence in the Pacific. But then how they seemed to be delivered was through projects such as AUKUS or GCAP, which essentially were big industrial development and procurement projects that involved Pacific allies. And while that's one way of approaching being present in the Pacific, if you were to just look at the language of past reviews, that's not necessarily the impression that it left with the reader. So I think the real difference is that this government is at least trying to fund all the elements that are in the review. And how I've heard it discussed is that it would be possible by the mid to late 2030s to achieve everything that's in the review with the amount of spending that has been announced. But my big question in all of this remains whether this timeline is actually sufficient, right? Because we've got other NATO member state intelligence services that have suggested that the threat from Russia is actually going to increase much faster than that, and that NATO has to be ready to contend with some sort of aggressive or more aggressive action from Russia, perhaps in the next 2 years, perhaps in the next 5 years. And if we look at a British defence force or a British defence system that's essentially ready to tackle the increasing threat from Russia by the mid to late 2030s, then that's a timeline that doesn't quite match with those intelligence estimates. So I think if it is true that the UK is going to try and spend even more, then perhaps we can deliver on some of these goals even faster. But the challenge remains that UK military has unfortunately been undermined over the last decade or 2 decades, and the current government is now in a really difficult position of needing to build up, but also building up quite quickly.
Grace, I want to come back to you on some of these strategic points that Marion is touching on there about what the threats to Britain are. You were foreign policy advisor to Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister, so that's way back. You're now an investor in private sector defence. That takes you across the great sweep of changes in defence. And 20-odd years ago, Britain and others were very preoccupied by the threat from terrorism, from non-state actors. Now we're back to talking about state actors like Russia and China as the big threats. How do you go about that in something like the Defence Review?
That's right. I think the review captures, I hope quite clearly, the reversion to thinking more clearly about state threats. Russia has made very clear the threat that it presents to Europe with its invasion of Ukraine. And China, although not an immediate threat in the same way that I think Russia is, Chinese technological investment and advancement is a very serious issue for the UK and its allies to contend with. When you look at the vast increase that the Chinese have achieved in advanced platforms and weapon systems, including their space warfare capabilities, they have achieved an unprecedented diversification and growth of conventional and nuclear missile forces. I think they're expecting to double their warhead stocks by 2030, and they have created the kind of kill web that you see referred to in the review.
You say kill web?
Kill web, exactly.
What does it mean?
What it means is the connection of what in military terms are called sensors, effectors and deciders. So sensors meaning cameras or any device that's capturing data at the edge, allowing that data to help a decider, so a person, to take a decision about using a military effect. And that might be to actually fire a weapon, or it might be to take some sort of other neutralising action that's short of kinetic. The Chinese have created something like this already in their region. The Ukrainians have done a very good job of creating something like this in their territory. We have described this in our review as a digital targeting web. This is really about making our defence targeting enterprise capable of dealing with the weight and pace at which targets move in this new era of warfare.
And how much does AI come into it? I'd love to hear from any of you. We're hearing a lot from Israel, from Ukraine, about using AI to use facial recognition and therefore to speed up the targeting enormously of this.
I think AI is essential to this. It's in simple terms, it allows humans to pass far greater amounts of data, to take decisions faster, to target more effectively at greater scale in a shorter time frame. And we've seen very vividly in Ukraine that pace is necessary, and for the UK to build up that kind of capability will require us to integrate AI more effectively than we have been able to date.
And I don't want to divert us too much, but you said crucially in that humans taking the decisions. Is there a point where even the decision making is set in advance and then essentially the machine takes it?
Right now, the UK's position is still that there will always be a human in the loop, that humans will always take a decision to use a weapon. I don't see that changing in the immediate future. I think there are legitimate concerns about allowing the machines to take too much authority over actual firing decisions. And I hope, personally, that we stick to that, because I think as wonderful as these AI systems are, there are still question marks in some areas around the assurance of the data in them, about their the cyber threats that might be able to be used against them. So I think we have to be cautious about delegating too much authority at this point.
A really important point. Olivia, I want to drop back to a more conventional point about the army, the military in general, but particularly the army has had a recruitment and retention problem. I'm not going to call it a crisis, but this review said it would put defence people at its heart. Has it managed to do that?
I think there's some welcome points and recommendations in the review about people. And it's interesting because tech is really threaded through the review, but as Grace said, humans remain a critical part of the kind of vision of the military that it sets out, and even some of the commitments to do things like ramp up submarine production. You need crews for these submarines. You need to think about the people who will be part of this, whether there's an attractive career offer for them in the military, whether it's something that young people are going to sign up for and want to do. Tech might mean that their roles change. They might do very different things if they're working in Cyber Command or some of these new recommendations and commitments in the review. The review focuses on doing something about housing. Military housing is in a very poor state. It focuses on offering more career flexibility. And that's welcome because it reflects the things that people who leave the military say about why they left the military. The military does surveys and asks people why they're leaving, and that comes up. But a few of the other things that come up are pay and better options elsewhere. Everything in this review is a recommendation that is still to be implemented. So the proof will be in the pudding as to whether the military can reverse the flow of people leaving, which is greater than
really
people
interesting
joining.
point. I went to a military wedding recently of a 30-something-year-old, and it was all, "Are you still in?" and eloquent on the reasons why not.
Can I jump in on that, just to pick up on what Olivia was talking about? I think it is really important to stress how much we as a review team felt that the marriage of technology and people was central to our vision. That while we do talk a lot about technology, and I'm a technology investor, I was leading and driving a lot of the work around the technology aspects of this, but it means nothing without the people being able to use the technology. So we talk in the review about finding, buying and using. Technology is a three-legged stool, right? You have to do each of those three things better and in concert. And there's no point reforming procurement, which we have set out a number of quite strong recommendations around reforming procurement, which is critical to this. But even if we did that tomorrow and were able to procure AI and software and drones in weeks, not years, if we don't have the people to deploy them and we don't have the underlying foundational IT systems in place to be able to plug all of that stuff into, it's just talk. So we can talk about drones and AI, but unless we have defence people able to extract the value from it, we're only really going halfway.
I think Olivia is really right that we have to see, of course, how this is going to be implemented. But I think even at this point, just the commitment to invest more in defense over the next 10 years, essentially, is going to really help with morale in the armed forces. Because I think one of the struggles that a lot of armed forces personnel have faced in the last few years is that if they had a concern or a complaint about the conditions under which they worked, they were also working in an environment where numbers were being cut. And there was this real sense that if defense is going to save somewhere, it's going to save probably on personnel numbers or, perhaps on something like housing. And so the fact that the review signals very strongly that that's no longer going to be the case, I think is already really important. And as Grace said, the focus on new technologies also means that the military can serve as a career boost. So even if you don't end up making a lifelong career in the military, you might be able to pick up the training and the skills that's going to allow you to have a really good career in the civilian tech sector, which UK government also wants to grow.
It's a really interesting point. We've seen that in spades in the American, the US Army and the technical units of that. Let me just turn to our second question and dig in a bit more deeply to some of these assumptions about the US, China, Europe. Olivia, this review, if I've read it right, seems to assume that relations with the US go on as they were. It even talks about deepening those relationships.
Well, I've read it the same way you have, I think. It talks about the fundamental assumption underpinning it is that the US remains the critical and essential security partner. It does say a few times that the US's security priorities have changed. As Grace says, there's a reflection that the US is seeking to focus more on the Indo-Pacific and bear less of the burden of European security. That's a long-signalled message, but it's a much more insistent message from the Trump administration. But you could argue that's a partial description. It's not just about priorities changing. If the trends and signals of the Trump administration continue, there's also a worry that the US is becoming a more transactional and potentially more unreliable partner in NATO. Now, a document like this would never say that outright or signal that, but we might be able to see in its priorities and recommendations and choices a desire to maybe think more about defence collaboration with Europeans or think about backfilling US capabilities in the very long term that might not be there. I think the reason that it doesn't do that is that, from what I can read and from talking to officials, the primacy placed on tech and this kind of diagnosis of the UK state is that if we want to be a significant power in the next 10, 20 years, we will have to be at the cutting edge of some of these technologies. And the available partner for us to do that is the US. And that's why it talks, regardless of the kind of politics of the Trump administration, we need to deepen these industrial and technological collaborations with America.
Right. And we've all been very polite so far about some of the searing things this report has said about the current state of the UK forces. So, as you said, putting weight on the future and ability to get into tech. Marion, what do you make of this relationship with the US? You're a nuclear expert, among many other things. But the UK's military capability is pretty intertwined with the US at the moment, isn't it?
That's right, yes. I mean, the UK nuclear capabilities, while independent, also rely on US industry quite heavily. And I think it's really interesting how the review points to potential collaboration with France and highlights that as a really important part for the nuclear enterprise as well, which is something that we at Chatham House have spoken about in months past. And I'm really curious about how that is going to develop going forward, because I think even just messaging-wise, it's really important for European NATO member states to get their deterrent signaling right vis-à-vis Russia, because for me, one of the prime concerns is not even necessarily whether European NATO has sufficient capabilities in terms of being able to make it in a potential war with Russia, but whether Russia is able to interpret those signals correctly, right? Because we know, unfortunately, that Russia tends to interpret NATO as a US project. And my biggest concern in the messaging we hear from the Trump administration is that Russia takes the wrong lessons from that and essentially might end up misinterpreting some of the signaling in a similar way how they seriously miscalculated how ready Ukraine was for a war, right? That essentially is my concern, that if Russia was to assume that because the Trump administration is not as dedicated to European security as previous US administrations might have been, that leaves an opportunity for Russia to essentially assert itself as a more serious security player in Europe. And so, because Russia is, of course, a nuclear weapon state, I think nuclear deterrence plays a really important part in that signaling.
Grace, on this question of how the UK positions itself, and it's made clear that Russia is a considerable threat. It's made clear that it wants to keep working with the US very closely and with NATO and so on. What about China? We spent quite a bit of time on this podcast in recent months talking about the UK's, I'm going to call it, torment of how to get that relationship right. Obviously wanting growth, wanting trading relationships, but increasingly concerned about security. How should people read this review in terms of what it says about China and where the UK is placing itself?
So I think probably the review's one of the main lenses on China is a technological lens. And as I said earlier, this enormous investment in technology that we've seen in China over many years, actually, fundamentally means that European forces, UK forces, in any war in the next decade are going to be facing Chinese technology. And that, I think, is the lens that really has informed how we thought about China as a threat, that it's really Chinese technological superiority that is requires us to up our game. And I think AUKUS remains a hugely important commitment. It doesn't mean we have a large footprint in the Indo-Pacific. It means that we're supporting allies who will have more of a footprint in that region. But to your earlier point about NATO and a possible perception of a gap being left in Europe, I think the NATO first framing of this review is really important, that we're saying the UK's near neighbourhood, the North Atlantic, is our priority, and that we need to work better with our European NATO allies. That includes interoperability with them in fighting terms. And it bringing back the China angle, it means that as we fight together as NATO, we need to be ready to deal with the kind of technology that comes out of Chinese supply chains to other potential adversaries.
And just to add, I think Grace makes a really important point here, and I think the supply chains are the other critical component, right? So not just that European militaries will be faced with Chinese technology, but also that a lot of our own production might rely on parts that might be produced in China. This is apparently already a challenge for a lot of munition production in Europe, where crucial parts need to be sourced from China. So I know logistics and supply chain questions are often seen as perhaps less interesting, but when we're talking about resilience and long-term readiness, then reforming those supply chains to make sure that we source from our partners rather than from potential adversaries is going to be really crucial.
That's a hugely important point that has come out of the Ukraine war as well. I want just finally, as we get towards the end of this, just to pick up a few of the points about technology. We've talked quite a bit about it, but I'm really interested still in this double emphasis in this report between the very big stuff, nuclear, and indeed submarines, lots of chat about the submarine commitments in the press, and then the hopes of developing the new low-cost tools like drones, which we've just seen Ukraine use to devastating effect against Russia. Retaliation threatened at the moment as we're speaking. Olivia, has the report got this balance right? There's a lot of questions around after it came out about whether the submarines in particular are really, really expensive on top of the really expensive nuclear deterrent.
I think the review has set defence a pretty big challenge because it keeps many of these big multi-stage, multinational procurement projects. It would have been very difficult to resile from them, including the fighter jet development programme with Italy and Japan, as well as AUKUS, the submarine development project with Australia and the US. But it also recommends quite a big shift in the culture and mindset and approach that defence takes to tech, including broadening the number of suppliers that it can call on. If you think about these huge projects, you have to be quite a big tech company to afford it, to manage the timeframes, to manage the complexity of that kind of project. But what Ukraine has been able to do is work with commercial, smaller suppliers, modify available tech. And the review is enthusiastic about that and wants UK defence to think about that. And there is real detail there. There's ring-fence money for new technology. There's targets for quicker procurement for uncrewed or commercially available technology. But it requires a big change in the way defence does things. And some of it isn't new. We've seen some of these ideas echoed in procurement reviews and recommendations before. So as with everything, so much is in implementation. And you do sometimes hear from folks in the military that there are tricky internal bureaucratic incentives. If your service has a big multi-stage, multinational technology development project, then that's a sunk cost that's politically very difficult to walk back from. If it's done with allies, it's pretty impossible to decide not to do it anymore or slow it down or change it. If you're working with smaller, more agile tech, it's really different, and you're under a bit more pressure to deliver more quickly and to innovate. So it's a cultural shift as much as a technological shift, I think.
Yeah, I think Olivia absolutely nails it. I think this incentivisation issue is a critical one, and it has frankly been too easy to cut things that were important for the future because you couldn't cut the things that were enormous political and capital investments.
And there's still a bureaucratic controversy over David Cameron putting the nuclear budget into the overall defence budget, and then it began eating all that up.
So I think, what we've really tried to do in the review is to protect the future-looking aspect of the equipment planning and investment. Olivia mentions the 10% ring fence for novel technology. That's the first time that spending on the future, if you like, has ever been formally protected. We have place some pretty challenging timelines onto procurement to bring down the average length of a procurement from 6.5 years down to no more than 2 years for the very long-term metal programme, ships and so forth.
2 years, what does that mean for ships? I mean, Britain has a amazing record of building ships.
Yes.
Well, building ships, but building ships very slowly and expensively and often late.
Yes. And we're trying to compress that. So 6.5 years is not acceptable in the environment that we find ourselves in now and the pace at which modern warfare is changing. You simply cannot take 6.5 years to procure a main battle tank or a ship. So we're trying to radically reduce those timelines for the if you like, the classic pieces of equipment. But where I think we hope to make a really important change is in segmenting the market and accepting that procurement methodology that works for a tank or a ship does not work for a drone or a piece of AI software, and that segment of the market should take no more than 3 months to get into use. That is an enormous cultural change for defence, and the implementation of those recommendations will be challenging. Much of it will fall on the shoulders of the National Armaments Director, which is a very, very important role that's been created through this process to lead a new relationship between defence and the private sector, because I think it's well recognised in the review and by John Healey, Defence Secretary, that defence is really only as strong as the industry that underpins it. And we need to establish a new kind of relationship with defence industry, including companies that wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as part of defence industry. I think there is a large number of UK and European and US allied companies out there which can support the mission of defence and security, but would not think of themselves as being defence companies. But they might be doing something interesting in AI or in sensors or in cybersecurity or IT in some form. Defence needs to go out and find those companies and help them see that there is a good market to be had.
That is really interesting. That is a huge cultural change, as you said, and a huge commercial change.
And I think that's incredibly important, but it's also going to be really difficult, in part because we've seen this in the space sector a little bit, where dual-use tech is perhaps already more common or more accepted. But the challenge is that a lot of smaller or medium-sized enterprises want to work on defense-related missions, but don't actually recognize what that means for them in terms of their own cybersecurity burden and so on, because they make themselves a target for Russia and China, essentially, without realizing. So I think this potentially has the possibility to be a real step change for UK industry, where government for a long time has tried to make sure that the UK is a really attractive place for tech startups, but has also struggled with retaining and supporting them beyond a certain size. So I think there's real potential there, but at the same time, I hope that in the implementation, we're already working on having really good instruction for these tech companies, how they can make sure that they actually work safely if they also want to be able to work on dual-use technology.
That is a fascinating point, a rather alarming one. Olivia, the final word on this, looking ahead to other government announcements. Are there going to be lots of jobs in this?
Honestly, I think when you read this review, I can see the Treasury advisors going through it and telling the writers to put more emphasis on growth. Of course, some of this investment, especially the things like ramping up the submarine production, that's critical for jobs in parts of the UK where that's done, and doing it with more intensity does suggest more job opportunities available. But I think we should have a note of caution about this because, of course, defence investment can have these spillover effects, but probably the thing we should be trying to do with defence spending is improve defence, not grow the economy. And we can get ourselves into trouble if projects become primarily about jobs or national champions. These kinds of issues have plagued defence spending in the UK and elsewhere before. So there's clearly potential for greater defence spending to contribute to growth. But I think if we make it the primary goal, either growth or signalling to President Trump or hitting an arbitrary % GDP target for spending, we muddy the waters of what we're trying to do, which is be more secure.
There is a whole lesson in there about not trying to get one policy to do several different goals. We're not going to expand on that right now. All three of you, thank you so much. Grace Cassy, Marion Messmer, Olivia O'Sullivan. And we're going to have to end there. If you've enjoyed today's discussion, please do leave us a review or suggestions of what we should cover next. We are always keeping our eyes out for that. Our producer this week was Amanda Nunn. I'm Bronwen Maddox. See you next week.